Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of TenzorGEO webinar series. This part focuses on an introduction to passive low frequency, taking a look at its history and the potential it holds for the oil and gas industry in the current times of oil crash. My name is Lev Frenkel. I'm an analyst at TenzorGEO, and I will be hosting this webinar and looking after the technical side of things. Dr. Roy Bitrus, Director of Sales at Tenzor, who will be presenting. Word to you, Roy.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for logging on to this three-part series webinar where I'll be talking about introduction to passive low-frequency seismic. Just in case any one of you would want to get in touch with any one of us just after the talk, this is our contact details. You can take a screenshot and you can reach us just after the talk. Thank you again for logging in. So I will jump straight into the talk. So TenzorGEO, who are we? TenzorGEO is a microseismic technology company, and we are pioneering the offshore development of low-frequency seismic as a direct hydrocarbon indicator in the North Sea. Now, over the next 25 minutes, I will give a brief intro into passive microseismic, its history, and opportunities for TenzorGEO in the oil and gas industry, especially in these current times and what we're facing. And I'll also talk about what's next in our three-part series and what we'll be focusing on. So, what is passive microseismic? I'm going to explain this in a very short video just so you have an understanding. Now, it is important to note that the Earth's surface and its interior has a constant background microseismic noise, the origin of which is inextricably linked to the processes taking place in the depths of the Earth. Now, passive microseismic refers to small-scale sound waves that are created by natural events and geological processes such as earthquakes, rock fracturing, rock slippage, and fluid migration within rock pores, and also by man-made events such as hydraulic fracturing during reservoir stimulation, and also any type of well injection. Now, geographically, locations like the Gulf of Mexico and Northwest Europe, which have been explored several times over, require companies to constantly fine-tune their data gathering techniques to find hydrocarbons through deeper and more complex geology, such as unconventional reserves, which are characterized by tight shale rock. These reserves are challenging for producers and have only recently become economically viable with the advent of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, which is one of the reasons why the US share of the oil market has risen to 15%. Now, the method of passive microseismic sounding or low-frequency seismic sounding is based on analyzing spectral properties of low frequency. We're talking of between 1 to 10 hertz. These are natural seismic background noises that changes above oil deposits. Now, here on the right-hand side of the spectrum, we notice an anomalous amplitude contrast between the hydrocarbon-bearing rocks and the surrounding media, as opposed to low amplitude contrast in the absence of a hydrocarbon-bearing rock on the left-hand side of the spectrum. The effect of change in low-frequency range of natural microseismic background above oil and gas deposit has been known since the 1990s and has been observed in various oil and gas regions. And scientists involved in seismic exploration have long been trying to record and exploit these low frequencies. Now, it is important to understand that these low frequencies are delicate in nature and can be easily contaminated by man-made noise, which is why their use has been limited to frequencies that are above 10 hertz. This means that to acquire and process these passive low frequencies, two things are majorly needed. One, a sensitive recording equipment, or what you would call broadband seismometers, and 2, specialist processing skills, both of which we offer at TenzorGEO. Now, I'd like us to take a look into the history of technology, as history informs the present and the future. It is worth noting that the Japanese seismologists over the last 25 years have developed the use of background noise into a mature science for engineering skill studies. However, Russian scientists have been able to demonstrate and prove that the spectral power of background noise above the hydrocarbon reservoir in the frequency range of 1 to 10 Hertz is higher than outside the hydrocarbon reservoir. Here's how it all started. The Russian Academy of Science, the Institute of Physics of the Earth, IPERAS as fondly called, was founded in 1928. And the institute built a renowned academic school in geophysics, seismology, experimental geophysics, and geoelectromagnetic research, where they played a leading part in studying the physical processes in the Earth's interior. They developed models of dynamics and internal structure of the Earth. And also, they developed the theory and information technology of interpreting geophysical data. Now, this institute was severely affected by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And as science research was no longer funded by the government, they had no choice but to move out. So this forced the most academic institutions in Russia at the time to look for ways to commercialize their research work. And what better way to commercialize your research than in an oil and gas industry? And so low frequency seismic was introduced into the oil and gas industry between 1991 and 98. And like any R&D task, LFS getting introduced into the industry had its own challenges. For a start, LFS needed scientists to create mathematical formulas and algorithms. However, these scientists will require libraries of data to play with, which were at the time non-existent. They also needed supercomputers for computational analysis, but it was also non-existent. So this stifled the recognition of LFS in the petroleum industry, not to mention that there wasn't enough trials and evidence to support it. By the time LFS came to the market in Russia in the early 90s, conventional seismic had already become the dominant method for exploration and appraisal. The prevailing scientific belief was that shorter waves with higher frequencies gave more information about the subsurface. And this turned most of the players away from low frequency seismic. Nowadays, conventional structured reservoirs are becoming rare as they have been exploited, and now field assets and frontier exploration reveal that hydrocarbons are located in areas with complex geology, where the application of conventional seismic is not as effective and can be significantly more expensive. Now, complex geology requires full wave inversion and complex maps, all of which form part of low-frequency seismic processing technique. A quick glance at the offshore magazine from the 1st of March of 2020 shows advances in the use of ocean bottom nodes and seismometers to improve the understanding of complex reservoirs, such as in sub-salt settings. So very quickly, the first company to apply the effect of anomalous low-frequency background noise to explore for hydrocarbon deposits was Anchar. And in the mid-90s, Anchar worked on large-scale projects for Russian oil majors like Gazprom, Lukoil, and Tafnet. At the time, Anchar's explanation for the anomalous phenomenon was that the low-frequency background noise was emitted by the hydrocarbon deposit itself, which presumably could be recorded on the surface. But this explanation drew criticism, as it was not sound from a physics and mathematical point of view, and could not be explained based on the processes taking place in the reservoir, and just couldn't be described. Now, unfortunately, their failure became apparent when they moved into new geological regions, as they did not build region-specific models and didn't take into account the specifics of the geology of the area and the cross-section when interpreting. This really affected Anchar at the time. Now, this led to the breakout of a few scientists from Anchar, and they moved abroad. And over time, these scientists got involved with 3 companies where they influenced their understanding of LFS. We have Geodynamics in Italy, we have Geotech in Greece, and we have Spectrasys AG in Switzerland, which is now part of the ESG solutions. These are companies that you can look into them and see what they're up to. Now, while all of this was happening, a few scientists from the RAS Institute of Physics worked in the background to advance the theory and application of LFS. And behind this was Professor Bryaltsev. And in 2003, he partnered with Russian supermajor Tafnet to apply the low-frequency seismic technology on their onshore fields. Now, Professor Bryaltsev and his interpretation team have been developing and applying the LFS commercially since 2003. Their work supported the resonance theory. They developed new methods of data processing and also described the phenomenon mathematically, thereby putting in place an LFS mathematical model of waves propagation in the media. They have since applied the technology in many petroleum provinces of the Russian Federation and have worked with one of the largest exploration and production companies, such as Gazprom, Rosneft, Lukoil, and also ONGC in India. The experience gained from the application of the technology in various provinces gave Professor Bryaltsev and team a huge competitive edge over others, as they proved successful over the past 15 years, with LFS delivering an over 85% success rate. Now, the success of LFS by Professor Bryaltsev and team onshore presented an opportunity to develop and replicate the passive frequency technology offshore. However, the technological challenges onshore are different from the challenges to be faced offshore. Now, this presented an opportunity for TenzorGEO to work with Professor Bryaltsev and pioneer the application of LFS technology offshore. Now, TenzorGEO was incorporated in 2018 to address the issue of small pools and marginal fields, and is partnered with a specialist interpretation team to advance the application of LFS offshore in the North Sea. The company was immediately recognized by the TechX Accelerator of the Oil and Gas Technology Center in Aberdeen as one of the companies with great potentials to help actualize the agenda of maximizing economic recovery. This recognition led to our first ever offshore field trial in the North Sea. The results of the field trial can be seen in our article, which is published on the TenzorGEO website, that's the link there. Now, we at TenzorGEO have the capability to deliver an end-to-end integrated and bespoke service that is suited to our clients' needs. We're talking from data acquisition to processing and interpretation of the data, to predict areas with the highest probability of hydrocarbon, to fracture mapping and fluid injection monitoring. We're able to offer this service as we have the right type of sensitive equipment for onshore and offshore data acquisition, which is environmentally friendly and doesn't require the use of air guns or an active source. We have the right team with decades of experience in the processing and interpretation of microseismic data. And we have also dedicated access to the UK's national supercomputing server, the Archer, in Edinburgh, where all our data processing and numerical simulations are conducted using our patented technology, which we have refined and adapted for offshore applications. Overall, our technology can be deployed across marginal and new discoveries and is delivered at a fraction of the cost of active seismic acquisition campaigns, and will save significant cost on drilling dry holes, as our hydrocarbon probability maps, modeled with low-frequency seismic, will potentially increase the chances of drilling commercial wells from 1 in 4 to about 3 in 4 wells, thereby replenishing reserves, enhancing extraction, and our technology can also be deployed across marginal and new discoveries. Now, in my next slide, I'll present an illustrative video so you can visualize the potential of LFS in the oil and gas industry. Again, the acquisition and process workflow of low-frequency seismic will be discussed in the part 2 of this webinar. Now, there are 2 layered models with and without a hydrocarbon layer on the right and left. The layered geological environment is kind of a filter for wave processes that generate the background microseismic noise. The fact is that the oil and gas deposits are an anomalous zone in the low frequency range, which has increased absorption at low frequencies. Now, the reason for the absorption is a multi-phase structure of the deposit consisting of a rock skeleton and a mobile phase of oil and gas. Now, as a low frequency wave passes through, the mobile phase appears here and there in the fractured porous rock skeleton. During this process, the internal friction leads to the wave energy transformation into thermal energy, as you can see here on the right-hand side, which now causes absorption. The contrast of absorption from the thin layer results in an anomalous reflection from the hydrocarbon deposits. This effect is almost never observed in the case of water-wet formations, since the difference between the physical properties of water and the rock skeleton are insignificant. Now, there are publications to support the theory that at low frequency, oil-saturated reservoirs reflect better than at high frequency. I'd oblige you to please check out our recent publication again on our website, and where we have case studies as well. Now, as we all know it, the oil prices have fallen more than 60% since the beginning of 2020. This is the lowest price in 18 years due to a price war, and it's all happening while we battle coronavirus and the price war. It just sounds like science fiction. Now, this has led to massive cuts in OPEX and CAPEX across the industry. This graph was taken from the OG UK Business Outlook, which was released last week. Now, these financial cuts have a negative impact on the industry and massively affect drilling in the UKCS, which before all of this was on a decline. Now, this puts a dent to the UKCS agenda of maximizing economic recovery. Now, in order to stay the course of MER in these hard times, exploration and production companies will have to further optimize their drilling costs following the low price cycle. One way to optimize their cost will be for these companies to make the most of their geoscience investments, as this is where it really counts. Currently, geoscience capability has drilled and shrunk the drilling of exploration dry hole to as low as 50%. This can be further reduced from 50 to 20%. Now, with the current state of the oil and gas industry and the plummeting price, the use of active seismic in exploration, especially in the area of 4D seismic acquisition, will eventually and possibly become unsustainable and unaffordable. The role of conventional seismic acquisition as we know it would need to be optimized and adapted. And I believe there is an opportunity to combine both active and passive acquisition in a sustainable manner across the oil and gas industry. Now, the use of passive seismic methods in the industry can be used to map hydrocarbons in marginal fields, bypassed assets, and small pools, and can also be used to monitor fractures and fracture propagation in hydraulic fracturing, and also monitoring the flow of fluids. It is important that we understand that the need for oil and gas as an energy source is not going anywhere soon. And drilling costs make up the largest expense in hydrocarbon recovery. And as we know it, cost reduction is king in a commodity world. So I'd oblige us that let's work together and fully develop the application of LFS sounding technology in the offshore industry, as this presents huge potentials for cost reduction in an industry that is struggling just now. So please, I would like you to join me in the part 2, where I'll be talking about the LFS technology in detail, and we'll look at case studies and how we can further develop this technology. Thank you. Any questions, please? Lev.
Yes, just sent you the list. We have just 2 at the moment.
Yeah. Do I need to exit this to go to? Yes, I think so.
And that's the 3rd one from Jake.
Okay. So I have first question here. It says, how does the technology work when the fluid and lithology response has a large overlap, i.e. separation between the responses is not possible?
Hi, Roy.
Hi, Abby. How you doing?
Not too bad. If you need further explanation on the question, I can do it.
Yes, please. I need further explanation on the question.
Yeah, I mean, geology, as we know, is not as simple as non-porous shale and nice sands, either charged with brine or hydrocarbon.
Yeah.
There's a lot of gray area in between.
Uh-huh.
And now, instead of, if I understand the technology correctly, instead of using reflection coefficient in conventional seismic, which is a function of impedance, we are using absorption as the discriminator. So my question is, what are the factors that absorption depends upon, where the non-uniqueness of, a poor, very shaly sand with hydrocarbon versus a nice sand with very high net to growth, but essentially brine field, that gray area, how does absorption discern between these 2 features?
So one of the factors which you've just mentioned also depends on depth, because at depth, most of the frequencies overlap, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from my understanding, with what we're using is we're using a VP, vertical VP
compressional velocity
waves, exactly.
Yeah.
And what happens is, depending on the size of the formation and the quantity of hydrocarbons or whatever type of hydrocarbon is in there, what happens is you're looking for, in the processing, I think you're looking for the absence of rather than the presence of. And that's why in the next talk, what I'll be talking about will be showing you how we do the model comparison with waves and the response that we get from the different types of formation. So for example, now you've just mentioned, if we had the same sandy formation reservoir with oil versus one that had probably a more dense sandy formation with the same density or similar density but has brine water, to differentiate between these 2 reservoirs. Exactly. So
the same response from different scenarios.
For different scenarios, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but what we would do is, usually, that's why we usually create 2 models. We create one with oil and one without oil. Because first of all, we need to understand what the Fourier transform and the reflective response we're getting from the model with oil and the model without oil. This is taking into consideration the VP. So that's why before we do any form of modeling, we always require from the client a VSP log. because we need to,
So you need
yes,
VFP. Okay.
yeah. So we need to understand what the velocity log of the formation is, because
Okay.
the velocity changes over time. Now,
Right.
once we're able to do that, we now place a hydrocarbon bearing layer versus a water bearing layer, and we're able to take out the Fourier transform of the responses that we get from these two models. Now we now compare that with what we acquire in the field. So we would deploy our ocean bottom seismometers, and over a period of recording hours, we'll be able to get the spectrum from that, and that's where we'll be able to compare and contrast between these two signals. And that's how we can differentiate, because it's like a fine art, but it takes more than it's just simply explained. But that's how we sort of differentiate.
Okay, so let me not hijack the Q&A session here. We will continue, but thanks for explaining the workflow.
We can have more chat later on, Abby, since I have got your email address and number. But also, most of this will be addressed in the second talk, which is why we had to break this into 30 minutes. We don't want a situation where it's just a whole hour of just talking. But in the next one, we will talk more specifically on how we can detect signals across a formation, the different lithologies, and where we place the hydrocarbon bearing, if it's in the Jurassic, the Triassic, within the formation, and how we can extract these responses and use that to create a hydrocarbon probability map.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next question is specialist processing skills. Is this subjective or objective? How does it vary from person to person in terms of accurate interpretation of data? Jake, thank you for your question. So when we say specialist processing skills, we're actually referring to people who have worked on onshore bases, who have been able to deal with the acquisition of low frequency data. So people who actually understand the various types of data responses that you would be expecting across various geological formations. And we happen to be dealing with the company as our partners who have built a library and host of experience in this data processing technique. So that's actually what I mean, specialist processing skills.
I think the second one just refers to, you talked a lot about, how sensitive the low frequency is, so how does the technology, take into consideration other noises, how does it make that delineation of, what is it actually capturing versus other noises that may potentially be, around the formation?
Yeah. So you can have that's why. So one of the criteria for us is the recording time. So if you deploy this sensitive, our ocean bottom seismometers or broadband seismometers, if you deploy them, what happens is you need to understand the type of background noise that you have. Now, I'll tell you, one of the first initial challenges that we had to overcome was the type of surface noise that you have onshore is different from what you have offshore. Offshore, you'll be dealing with Charlotte waves, and Charlotte waves are slow waves, and this can actually mimic the type of signal that you're trying to find out from your reservoir. So we had to create a triangulation filtering system to understand that, okay, if we get any signal between this frequency and that frequency, this is our Schulte waves, and anything beyond that, this is what we're looking for. We were able to find from the North Sea trial, we're able to find that the most optimal frequency range for us was between 0.3 and 1.9. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ivan. It was between 0.3 and 1.9 frequency that we found to be the most optimum to discover or detect hydrocarbons. I have another question that was, Jake, does that answer your question, please?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Thank you very much. And yeah, brilliant presentation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I have another question that was sent privately. It says, if the technology has a great track record in the oil and gas industry and has been proven onshore, why hasn't the technology been tried offshore in Russia? That's a valid question to ask. Now, we need to understand that in Russia, the proportion of offshore oil and gas is very small, and it's just a few percent. And most of the offshore fields in Russia are in the Arctic, where there's very little conventional seismic available. And that acquisition is very difficult due to the weather. I think I was reading just recently that the Chinese people had deployed one of their drilling vessels there for just a month or two, and that was it. They had to withdraw just because of the bad weather, ice conditions. So anyone who wants to do any form of offshore acquisition in Russia needs to have a powerful icebreaker, and that's just a whole nother world. It's another world on its own, and so that's why it hasn't been applied in offshore Russia, and that has given us an opportunity to be the first in pioneering this in the UKCS and in the North Sea. Is there any more questions? Yeah. Dennis, any question?
Sorry, I don't have anything, but I think there was some questions from Myrtle Dawes.
Yes, she says she needs to go, but she wanted to know how this can be applied in energy transition. Well, I believe in energy transition, the whole idea of energy transition is to look for low energy technologies that will contribute less to CO2 emissions, basically. This is something that I would need to probably revert back to her on a more specific answer as to how this will help in contributing to energy transition.
Roy, can I jump in and put my 2 cents?
Yes, yes, please. Yes, please.
One of the things that I could think of, and this is along the lines of permanent monitoring around CCS. I mean, Northern Lights in Norway comes across as one example, which is already in motion. There are a few other CCS projects where what you basically need to do is find out as you push CO2 in brine or CO2 within depleted reservoir, that over a period of 50 years, 70 years, massive time scale, there is no repressurization, and you have behind pipe communication for any remnant hydrocarbon to come up the seabed.
Yeah.
So you need something which is fairly low maintenance and can stay put in the seabed without spending a lot of money, because CCS currently doesn't have a viable economic model.
No.
So anything cheap and cheerful from a monitoring point of view, this could probably be a good value addition.
Okay. So that also means that another area I could think of as well was in the area of decommissioning.
Mm-hmm.
Because I believe in decommissioning, there's a lot of disassembly of assets and decommissioning of assets, and you want to know what's happening while the decommissioning is taking place.
Yeah, I mean, decommissioning and CCS monitoring is just the scale of time that we are talking about. Because decommissioning, you've got a lot of old exploration appraisal wells which have essentially not been plugged in. The cement job is not done properly. When we look at the plugging strategy for existing producer wells, we need to understand how we are going to keep whatever's left as it is, and we don't have any behind pipe communication, thereby making these ENA wells conduit for the hydrocarbon to come to the surface. If there is any resegregation after tens of years. So that's applicable there as well.
Okay. I think we have another question from Myrtle. She says, have you developed LFS in Sakhalin? That's offshore Russia, not in the Arctic. Sakhalin it's not, it's when you say offshore, it sounds like Sakhalin is, so I've got the data for Sakhalin, and in fact, I'm going to use that as a case study for next week, for the next talk in 2 weeks' time. And Sakhalin offshore is not deep offshore. It's not major offshore. It's actually a channel that has hydrocarbons and accumulations of hydrocarbons. So it wasn't, I think water depth was like less than 10 meters. So that's a different scenario. Unlike if you're talking about water depths of 90 meters to 100 meters, and even more if you're talking of deep offshore.
Roy, if I might jump in, Sakhalin was in transition zone. That was the stretch of investigation was starting on land, going into the sea. And you can, so although that was proven that readings can be done in the water and effectively offshore, but it cannot be claimed as a like full-scale offshore
deployment.
Yeah. So yeah, so this notice from Merlin is absolutely correct. It was done in Sakhalin. Yes, this technology was tested, but the first full-scale offshore, proper depths, proper oil field was only done in the UKCS.
In the UKCS, yes. Okay, any more questions? Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, I would like to invite you guys for the next talk. I'll send invitations out. I'll be speaking more on the technology, and Abby, I'll be addressing some of the questions that you've just raised on the technology itself and how you can distinguish between an oil-rich reservoir or a densely packed formation with water, basically. So maybe more.
I'll send you an email elaborating the question a little more, because I think the question needs elaboration.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you, Abby, and I'll respond to that. And we thank you very much, gentlemen, for attending. Gentlemen and ladies, for attending this talk. Very much appreciated. And I would send invitation for the part 2. This video will also be recorded and will be made available online, and the link will be sent and shared to everyone who's participated.
Brilliant. Thanks, Roy.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Roy.